Today we're going to be drawing a cute stylized bookshelf in Procreate. You can do a quick stylized bookshelf search on Pinterest, and there are a lot of really fun images to get ideas from. So you can kind of do a quick scroll through and you can see the way they have books lined up by colors or like really fun objects on the shelves and that kind of thing. And you can save them all to a board and have a quick reference for how you'd like your stylized bookshelf to look. If you need help with that, or if you don't feel like scrolling through, I'll share my Pinterest board with the bookshelves that I love the most. If you just wanted to practice with doing like your shadows and your highlights and everything, you didn't necessarily want to draw the full bookshelf, I'll include this page in a link in the description, and also a blank bookshelf so you could just focus on stylizing your bookshelf and not necessarily having to worry about drawing the bookshelf itself. So I'll include both links in the description. First we need to draw our bookshelf. I like to use the rectangular quick shape tool, so I would draw that first and then I draw in rectangles for my shelves, arrange them the way that I think it looks equally distributed and eye-pleasing, and then I start loading it with books and objects. I did a quick Google search and put it side by side with my Procreate app so I could get an idea of how to arrange my books in baskets, plants, and objects. Don't forget to include some fun objects on stacks of books and some books facing the wrong direction. I like to include objects like this metal orb. Metal objects give you something really fun to color, and also I think they look really cute on a bookshelf, so I wanted to be sure to include some things like that. It's also really fun to include some different elements on the spine of the book, so you can make it look like it's a set of books, something that has like interesting things on the binding, some books that are flipped around backwards so you can see the pages, and stuff like that. An initial or monogram element is always kind of fun. In the end, I couldn't figure out how to make this work in my design, so I ended up removing it. But it's kind of fun to have like your last initial or your first letter of your first name or something like that. And of course, lots of plants. I decided to give my bookshelf a little dimension. And also a rug to go underneath so it wasn't just floating in the air, and a tree in a basket next to the bookshelf. So the fun part of every project is always coloring, right? So I wanted to show you how I make my color palettes. I feel like it's kind of important to have a color palette that is like inspiring and something that just like happy and fun that's going to give you some motivation to finish your project. You can use the palette that's built into the Procreate app just by selecting colors up here and then coloring it as you need to. Or if you have a larger iPad screen, it lets you pop it out by dragging down and just placing it anywhere on the screen. So you can move it around to keep it out of your way as you're coloring. But what I like to do, because sometimes this does get in my way, even though it's very small and you can move it around, I like to just make my palette in a layer so I can quickly siphon up color as I need to. So I make a fresh layer, and then I know I'm going to use some of the colors from this particular palette. So let's say I want to get this like orangey color. And in my new layer, I'm just going to kind of like place down a little bit of the color. So when I need to, I can just hold my finger on it to siphon it up, and then I've got my color. So I'm going to place all the colors that I think I'm going to use here. And I have a trick for how to blend colors as well. So those are a few that I know I'm going to use. But let's say I wanted like a more orangey color that's kind of like in between these two. So I usually like to use the colors I've already have in my palette to blend these colors. So I'm going to take a little bit of that yellow, and I'm going to take the opacity down about halfway, and then just color over top of my pinkish reddish color here, and that gives me an orange. I like to siphon that up and then take the opacity all the way back up to 100%, and then I'll just make a little swatch of that color. And now I have something that's in between these two tones. The same for like if I wanted a lighter blue. So I'm gonna siphon up that and take my opacity down about halfway, and there's my lighter blue. Now you could color with that in your picture if you want, but if you saw what just happened, whenever you have to color it all in one pass. If you lift your pen and then you need to fill in a little more space or whatever, when you go over it, it's going to be like a glazed effect. So the part that you overlap, it's going to be a little darker. Usually, unless I'm specifically going for that effect, I don't want that to happen. So instead of just using this color and adjusting the opacity, number one, you have to remember what percentage of opacity you chose over here to keep it consistent throughout your drawing. And number two, it's going to overlap like this whenever you, it's going to be darker in areas like this whenever you overlap. So instead of dealing with that, I just siphon it up and right away make a little swatch, and then I know when take that all the way back up to 100% so I don't have to mess around with the opacities. I know when I siphon it up, that's the color I'm going to get, and there's no glazing effect when it overlaps or whatever, because you're just painting with the pure color. Let's say I want to make like a little bit of a greenish tone. So in the same layer, I'm going to take it down about halfway, and let's try it with this lighter one. And you can go over top of your yellow and get like a little bit of a green. I probably need to use the darker one. And then I lay down that color, and I probably want something that's a little bit in between, a little darker too. So I'm going to use this blue, reduce my opacity so I can glaze over top of my yellow. Just add a little swatch there, siphon that up, and then undo that. Take this all the way back up to 100% so I can lay down the true color right there. And that's how I create my palettes. And then as I'm going through my drawing, all I have to do is siphon the color and color in my picture, so I don't have to keep going into this menu a lot of times. It's a little easier for me, so I hope that tip helps you as well. Another thing I do when I set up my canvas for coloring is I make a layer for the color, I make a layer for shadows, and I make a layer for highlights. So the way I set that up in advance is I'll make a layer underneath of my initial drawing so that I don't have to worry about like staying in the lines and whatever. It'll go underneath of the black lines. I think it's a little more forgiving, easier to color that way. So that's going to be my layer where I'm coloring. So this is my main color layer. On top of my color layer, I set a new layer for shadows. And I use a blending mode of either multiply or color burn. You can kind of play with these a little bit to see which you prefer or what works for your particular drawing. Sometimes I'll use multiply when I want a certain effect, sometimes I'll use color burn. I'm going to set this one to multiply for now, and I can always change it down to color burn if I want to see what that effect looks like or if I'm not happy with the multiply layer. And I make one more layer for highlights. So this is going to be my highlights. And if you label them, it's much easier to keep organized. So for this, I kind of play around with different ones. I tend to use screen or lighten. You can kind of play with it too. Color dodge is a really intense effect, so I tend not to use that as much. There's also like soft light, vivid light. You can kind of play around with it a little bit to see which mode you like, but I usually use screen. So I'll show you how it looks when you have the blending mode set to those particular blend modes. So let me just color like a little bit of this bookshelf. I already have my color palette there. I'm going to siphon up a little bit of my blue there and just color this in kind of messy, because I'm not too concerned about how it's looking, because I just want to show you an example. So let's say like, there we go, we got like that little swatch of the bookshelf colored. Let's say I want like a shadow in here behind the books or like on the side here. So I'll go up into my multiply layer I don't really have to do anything because it's already going to darken it. So I don't have to mess around with colors or whatever. I'm actually just going to keep the same color. You could play around with like maybe a little darker shade and just see how it looks. But I'm just going to use that same exact color. And when I go in and color it, it automatically is darkened. So that creates a quick shadow layer. Maybe a little bit back in here. And so like this part here, that probably wouldn't be shaded like that. But this is just to show you an example. So I would probably make that one actually lighter. But you can see how it's really easy to add shadows in when you have your layers set up like that. And then let's go in our highlights layer. There we are in our highlights layer. I have the same exact color selected, so it's this teal blue again. I didn't change anything. And when you swipe over, you can see how it automatically is lighter. And that's a really easy way to add in your dark and your light tones without having to mess around with selecting like the appropriate colors that are gonna match or whatever. Another thing sometimes is I'll use a light gray. So just use this black, turn it down a little bit here, just make a quick swatch of the gray. So in my shadow layer, if I'm using this gray, it's a little bit, you know, more of like a gray tone for the shadow, but it still has a little bit of that color because it's kind of like glazing over top of your blue. So if you had just selected that gray and tried to like add your shadows in on your straight color here, like on your color layer, it doesn't really look that natural. Like it looks really gray, and that's not how a shadow would really look. So what I like to do is use that gray in a multiply layer, and you can see it has more of like that blue tone with it because it's multiplying over top of your color tone. It's not just adding like this straight up gray onto your image. So sometimes I'll use a gray, and then that's kind of an easy way to go throughout the whole painting. Like you can just add in your shadows over your books, which are going to be different colors. The books will be different colors, and you don't have to worry about selecting like the exact color of the book. And that's one way that I quickly add shadows into my work. So you can see like if that book was red, let's say this next one was yellow, it still looks good, and it's not like a straight up gray, but it's not like a saturated color either. So it kind of depends on the look you're going for, but that's a really quick way to add shadows and highlights. You do the same for highlights. So I still have that gray color selected, and then when you go in and add your highlight, it still has some of the tones from the main color layer. So that's a really fast way to add shadows and highlights. And you can do it either way. You could do it with the color of your book. So let me show you what that would look like. Very similar. But you have to go through and choose your book color every time, which isn't that big of a deal because you could actually just siphon it up from your actual object. And you can see how it's a little bit more of the color tone versus the gray is a little more whitish. Or desaturated, I guess I should say. So it just depends what you're going for, and also like how quickly you want to go through and add in your shadows and highlights. But those are the most often the ways that I add shadows and highlights to my work. So let me know if that's helpful for you too. And we're going to keep coloring this, and I would love to see how you color yours as well. I'm just going to get started coloring this in the way that I just showed you, using the same methods that I just went over for the shadows and the highlights. First, I'm just going to lay down a flat color in my color layer and just kind of like fill in this whole scene. If you just wanted to practice with doing like your shadows and your highlights and everything, you didn't necessarily want to draw the full bookshelf, I'll include this page in a link in the description, and also a blank bookshelf so you could just focus on stylizing your bookshelf and not necessarily having to worry about drawing the bookshelf itself. So I'll include both links in the description. So I'm just going to go ahead and color it in the main coloring layer, and then we'll add in some shadows and highlights. For my coloring, I'm using a brush from my Rough and Tough bundle, and it's number 16 called Soft Chalk. It's one of my favorites. It just goes on really smooth and it gives like this nice rough look to it where it's not too perfect but not too messy either. One thing I would like to add is that sometimes I need to color in layers. So you can see I don't want to color over top of these leaves, but I want to color this planter. So what I do in that case is I just make a layer underneath of my leafy layer, and I'm going to grab the color that I'd like to make my planter. Let's try this like pink color. And then I go ahead and fill that in. And I kind of want to leave a little white space around some of those leaves where it's showing through, like in that area. I don't necessarily want it to look like that. So I'm going to kind of like go around those things a little bit just to preserve some of the white space. And then once you have it colored in and you think it looks good, you can flatten it down, or you can leave this layer separated. Sometimes I'll leave it separate and then just use it as my my layer for like stuff that's in the background. So maybe like if there's another thing, like maybe down here, these rolled up like maps or whatever, maybe I could color those in this same layer. And then in the foreground on the layer on top would be like this basket, and see how the basket is three-dimensional. So you might want to have this this area that's like inside the basket in a separate layer, just so you don't have to be so careful going up to the edge of the line and whatever. You can color behind the layer that's this main area of the basket. So I tend to keep like multiple layers, but if that's confusing for you, or if you don't like having so many layers open, you can just merge them down and then you have all your color in one layer. I like to keep them separate and put them in folders. So you could just select both those layers and then group, and then you have like your colored area here in this folder, and that kind of keeps things organized too. Another thing I like to do that I think makes it look kind of like cute and appealing is distributing your colors evenly. So I tend to make like similar colors kind of like spread out throughout the picture. So if there's like pink over here, I don't want to make all my books on this side pink. I kind of want to like scatter them throughout the image. Another thing you could do is, I think some of the bookshelves look really cute when it's all grouped by color or like in rainbow. Like you could do like some pink, and then maybe these two could be like orangey, especially since this one's turned around backwards. And then you can kind of do like those tones, like maybe these pinks and the orange on this shelf, and then here you could do like the yellows and the greens, and those look really cute when you see images like that on Pinterest or in a Google image search, when the bookshelves are like arranged in rainbow order. I have my little one's bookshelf arranged like that. And it just makes it look so cheery and happy rather than like this haphazard arrangement of books that looks all messy. So you could try something like that and see how it looks in your picture. I tend to just kind of like scatter the colors throughout the image and try not to keep anything that's too clustered together as far as like the similar tones and stuff. When you're coloring a large area like this bookshelf, if you don't want to be bothered to stay in the lines, you can go into your drawing layer, your outline, and select that, and then go to the select tool with automatic turned on, and then you kind of just select the area that you want to be colored for your bookshelf or whatever, and you pick up all the little pieces here. And I would just do the frame. I wouldn't do the inside because I want that to be a little bit darker color. So you can just select the whole thing and then go back into your layer where you're coloring. Grab the color you wish to use, and then you don't have to worry about staying in the lines. You can just go like this, and it's really fast. Sometimes I like there to be like a little bit of like a white space around the edges, so it doesn't go straight all the way to the outline, like all the way to the border. But if you're in a hurry and you need to color it fast, that's a really easy way to do it. And then you could also do the interior layers here too. So like the interior of the bookshelf, I mean to say. So you go into your outline, grab your select tool with automatic turned on, and you can kind of just pick up, as long as it has a clear border, it'll let you pick up any of these little areas here. If it's spilling in like that, it means there's an opening. So you can just scale it back a little so it doesn't pick up as much, and see if that helps you. You can see it still picked this part up. So an area like that won't work because there's a little gap right here. So it's not going to pick up. You have to seal that off and then it'll be able to be selected. But you could do that to kind of save yourself a little time if you don't feel like going in and coloring so carefully. So I'm going to do those areas that are sealed off and allowing me to do it for now, and then I'll come back and pick up those other areas. You can see how much faster that is. But you do have to be careful because I didn't notice it picked up the area that's this metal orb thing, so I don't want to color that blue. So you do have to kind of be careful and make sure you're not just sweeping through with your brush and like ruining your picture and overlapping areas you didn't really want to overlap. So just pay attention and make sure you've selected the areas that you think you selected. And since I'm coloring this in a new layer, I could always go back in with an eraser and kind of clean it up a little too if I did accidentally overlap something like that. I'm not coloring directly on the original layer there. But if you enjoy the coloring process, which I think it's fun, I don't necessarily want to rush through it and like just sweep through it with the brush because it's not perfect. It sometimes leaves these little edges and stuff even when you're careful about your selection threshold. Sometimes I think it's fun to color it in, and I want it to look a little bit messy and irregular and stuff, so it kind of depends if it's a project you got to finish quickly or if you don't feel like coloring it. But if you do, then certainly feel free to just go through and color it all in by hand. I think that gives it kind of like a nice look too, like it's actually hand drawn when it's a little bit imperfect and messy. So now we're going to go through and add in our shadows and highlights, which is another really fun part of a project like this. So I'm going to go into my shadows layer. Probably for most of them, I'm just going to go with the color that they are. So you can just siphon it up directly from your object. Make sure you're in your shadows layer. And then just kind of start going through and adding in a little bit of shadows here and there. Since I have it with the color of the object instead of with gray, it's going to create this more saturated look, which is kind of what I was going for with this piece. But you could certainly just go through with your gray color through the entire illustration, and that's much faster because you can just speed along and add in all your shadows, but you can see how the effect is just going to be a little bit different. So I've done as much of my shadows as I want in this picture. I'm going to go through and add in my highlights in that layer that we created earlier. I'm going to use this screen blend mode, but you could play around with the blend modes and see which one works for you. And I'm going to do the same method by just siphoning up the color of the object and adding the highlight that way. You could also try it with just going through the whole thing with the gray, and that might work for you as well. And you can also kind of see how the different blend modes can be affected depending like which one you choose. Add is like a really bright, it would be like a really bright light. There's screen, lighten, it's barely visible on most of them. So I'm going to just stay with the screen. You could also do color dodge, but I usually use the screen blend mode, but you can certainly go through and see which ones work for your piece. So that's all the highlights I'm going to add to this one. You can certainly play around with it and add more or less, but I like it like this. I'm just going to try to keep it kind of like simple. So then the last thing would be to turn your color palette back off or erase it out, and you could sign your work here. There we go. So it's just like a fun little coloring project, and it's kind of fun to stylize your own bookshelf in real life and in a drawing like this. If you share your work on Instagram, be sure to tag me at MyMcDoodles or hashtag MyMcDoodles so I can share your beautiful creation. If you think this was fun, then be sure to like this video and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on the next fun tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.